A lady calls the cops on a black dad with a white child, convinced that she's protecting the girl. But within 10 minutes, she realizes she made a massive mistake when karma hits her. Before we get into the story, comment below where in the world you are watching from today. And if you like this story, don't forget to subscribe. Janet smoothed her crisp blouse and adjusted her pearl necklace as she approached the department store for her interview. The sun glinted off the polished windows, and she squinted, taking in the neat displays. A surge of confidence filled her chest. This was her moment. "I've got this," she whispered to herself, pushing open the heavy glass door. A cheerful bell chimed, announcing her arrival. The store was immaculate, with gleaming floors and neatly arranged racks of clothing. Janet nodded approvingly. She liked order, and this place had it in spades. "Hello there," a warm voice called out. "You must be Janet." Janet turned to see a woman about her age with kind eyes and a welcoming smile. She wore a simple but elegant dress and had her hair pulled back in a neat bun. "Yes, that's me," Janet replied, extending her hand. "Janet Mary, it's a pleasure to meet you." "Martha Brown," the woman said, shaking Janet's hand firmly. "Welcome to our store. We're so glad you could come in for the interview today." Janet's eyes darted around the store, taking in every detail. "I must say, Mrs. Brown, your establishment is quite impressive. Very tidy." Martha beamed with pride. "Thank you. My husband James and I have put our hearts into this place. We built it from the ground up." As they walked towards the back office, Janet noticed a young girl sitting quietly in a corner, engrossed in a picture book. The child looked up and waved shyly. Martha followed Janet's gaze. "Oh, that's our daughter, Lily. She's staying with me today while James is away on a business trip." Janet nodded politely. Once in the office, Martha gestured for Janet to take a seat. "So, Janet, tell me about your experience in retail management." Janet sat up straight, her rehearsed answers flowing smoothly. She detailed her years of experience, her knack for organization, and her dedication to customer service. Martha listened attentively, nodding and asking thoughtful questions. As the interview progressed, Janet grew more confident. Martha seemed impressed by her responses, and Janet could almost taste the job offer on her lips. "Well, Janet," Martha said after about 20 minutes, "I must say your qualifications are excellent. You seem like a great fit for our team." Janet beamed, her chest swelling with pride. "Thank you, Mrs. Brown. I truly believe I could bring a lot to your store." Martha smiled warmly. "I agree. In fact, I think I've seen enough to offer you the position. You are the last applicant of the day, and the best one so far. What do you say?" Excitement bubbled up inside Janet. This was exactly what she'd hoped for. "I would be delighted to accept, Mrs. Brown. Thank you so much for this opportunity." As they stood to shake hands, Janet felt a wave of relief wash over her. She'd been struggling financially lately, and this job was just what she needed to get back on her feet. "I'm just so thrilled to be joining your team. When can I start?" Janet asked. Martha smiled and said, "How about tomorrow?" "Perfect," Janet exclaimed. "I'll see you then, Mrs. Brown. Thank you again for this wonderful opportunity." As Janet gathered her things and headed for the door, she felt on top of the world. She'd nailed the interview and secured the job. Everything was falling into place. Martha walked her to the front of the store where Lily was still engrossed in her book. The little girl looked up and smiled at Janet, who gave her a quick nod in return. "Goodbye, Mrs. Brown," Janet said cheerfully. "I'm looking forward to working with you." As the bell chimed again and Janet stepped out into the sunlight, she felt a sense of triumph. She'd done it. She had the job. Everything was going to be okay now. Back inside the store, Martha stood still for a moment, relieved that she finally found the right person for the job. She looked at Lily, who was now watching her curiously. "Mommy?" Lily asked. "Is everything okay?" Martha forced a smile. "Yes, sweetie. Everything's fine. How about we close up a little early today and go get some ice cream?" Lily's face lit up. The next day, Janet's eyes fluttered open as the morning sun peeked through her curtains. For a moment, she lay still, wondering why she felt so excited. Then it hit her. Today was her first day at her new job. A smile spread across her face as she jumped out of bed, eager to start her day. She picked out her best blouse and skirt, wanting to make a good impression on her first day. While applying her makeup, her gaze fell on the stack of bills on her dresser. The smile faded slightly as she remembered the mountain of credit card debt she'd accumulated over the past few months. "Not today," she muttered, shaking her head. "Today is a new start." With renewed determination, Janet grabbed her purse and headed out the door. As she drove to the store, her mind raced with possibilities. This job was her chance to turn things around, to finally get ahead. The little bell chimed as Janet entered the store. Martha was already there, arranging a display near the front. "Good morning, Janet," Martha said, her smile warm but not quite reaching her eyes. "Ready for your first day?" Janet nodded enthusiastically. "Absolutely, Mrs. Brown. I can't wait to get started." Martha led Janet through the store, introducing her to the other employees and explaining the daily routines. Janet soaked it all in, asking questions and making mental notes. She was determined to excel in her new role. As the day progressed, Janet found herself settling into a rhythm. She helped customers, organized shelves, and even assisted with some inventory tasks. Each time Martha praised her work, Janet felt a surge of pride. As closing time approached, Janet felt a sense of accomplishment. She had navigated her first day successfully, and she was already thinking about ways to improve the store's efficiency. Martha approached her as she was tidying up the counter. "Well, Janet, how was your first day?" "It was wonderful, Mrs. Brown," Janet replied, beaming. "I really feel like I'm going to fit in here." Martha nodded, her expression unreadable. "I'm glad to hear that. Just remember, we're closed on Sundays, so you'll be back on Monday." "Of course," Janet said, gathering her things. "I'll see you then. Thank you again for this opportunity." As Janet left the store, the setting sun cast a warm glow over the street. She felt a sense of optimism she hadn't experienced in months. This job was going to change everything. She just knew it. Little did Janet know, as she walked to her car with a spring in her step, that the coming week would bring changes she could never have anticipated. As the bell chimed softly behind Janet's departing figure, Martha let out a long, relieved sigh. The weight of running the store alone had been heavy on her shoulders, and now, with Janet's help, she felt a glimmer of hope. She walked around the store, straightening a few items here and there, her mind already planning for the upcoming week ahead. Just as she was about to lock up, her phone buzzed in her pocket. A smile spread across her face when she saw James's name on the screen. "Hello, darling," she answered, her voice warm with affection. "Martha, honey." James's deep voice came through, filled with excitement. "I've got great news. I wrapped up everything early, and I'll be home tomorrow morning." Martha's heart leaped with joy. "Oh, James, that's wonderful. Lily will be over the moon." They chatted for a few more minutes, sharing the highlights of their week apart. As they said their goodnights, Martha felt a renewed sense of energy. She hurried home, eager to share the news with Lily. That night, as Martha tucked Lily into bed, she whispered, "Guess who's coming home tomorrow?" Lily's eyes widened. "Daddy?" she gasped, sitting up in bed. Martha nodded, grinning. "That's right, sweetie. He'll be here in the morning." Lily squealed with delight, bouncing on her bed. "Can we make him pancakes, please, Mom?" "Of course we can," Martha laughed, kissing Lily's forehead. "Now get some sleep. The sooner you close your eyes, the sooner morning will come." As Lily snuggled down under her covers, Martha turned off the light, her heart full of love for her little family. On Sunday morning, Martha and Lily were up early, the kitchen filled with the sweet aroma of pancakes and the sound of Lily's excited chatter. When they heard the familiar rumble of James's car in the driveway, Lily raced to the door, Martha close behind. The door swung open, and there stood James, his broad shoulders filling the doorframe, a wide smile lighting up his face. "There's my girls!" he exclaimed, dropping his bags. Lily launched herself into his arms with a squeal of "Daddy!" James scooped her up, spinning her around as she giggled uncontrollably. Martha stepped forward, wrapping her arms around both of them, completing their family circle. For a moment, they stood there, holding each other tight, savoring the warmth of their reunion. James planted a kiss on Martha's lips, then set Lily down, ruffling her hair affectionately. "Something smells amazing," he said, sniffing the air appreciatively. "We made pancakes," Lily announced proudly, tugging on his hand. "Come on, Daddy, before they get cold." As they sat around the kitchen table enjoying their breakfast, Martha couldn't help but marvel at the man across from her. James's kind eyes crinkled at the corners as he listened intently to Lily's animated recounting of her week. His large, strong hands, so gentle as they cut Lily's pancakes into bite-sized pieces, were a testament to his caring nature. "So how did everything go at the store?" James asked, turning his attention to Martha. Martha smiled, reaching across the table to squeeze his hand. "It went well, thanks to you. Your hard work has really paid off, James. And I have some good news, too. I hired a new manager to help out." James's eyebrows rose in surprise. "That's fantastic, honey. Tell me about it." As Lily munched on her pancakes, Martha filled James in on Janet's hiring. "She seems capable, and it'll be a big help to have another pair of hands around the store." James nodded, his expression thoughtful. "I'm proud of you, Martha. I know it wasn't easy managing everything on your own this past week." Martha's eyes softened. "We're a team, James. Your support means everything to me." A comfortable silence fell over the table as they finished their breakfast. Martha's mind wandered back to when she first met James, a single mother struggling to make ends meet after Lily's father had abandoned them. Despite the sideways glances and whispered remarks about their interracial relationship in their small town, James, a proud black man, had stood by her side, loving her and Lily unconditionally. As if reading her thoughts, James reached out and took her hand. "I love you," he said simply, his eyes conveying a depth of emotion that words couldn't express. "I love you too," Martha replied, her voice thick with emotion. Lily, oblivious to the deeper currents of the moment, piped up, "Can we go to the park today, Daddy? Please?" James chuckled, turning to his daughter with a twinkle in his eye. "You know what, Princess? That sounds like a great idea. How about we head there tomorrow morning? We can have a fun day out, just the two of us." Lily clapped her hands in delight. "Yes, can we feed the ducks and go on the swings?" "We can do all of that and more," James promised, his smile wide and genuine. As Martha watched her husband and daughter plan their outing, her heart swelled with love and gratitude. Lily then went to bed, excited about her next day out to the park with her dad. The next morning, the sun was just peeking over the horizon as James and Lily arrived at the park. The morning air was crisp and fresh, filled with the sweet chirping of birds greeting the new day. Lily's eyes sparkled with excitement as she took in the empty playground before her. "Look, Daddy, we're the first ones here," she exclaimed, tugging on James's hand. James chuckled, his deep voice warm with affection. "That we are, Princess. Where do you want to start?" Without hesitation, Lily pointed to the swings. "Can you push me really high?" "Of course," James replied, leading her to the swing set. He carefully helped her onto the seat, making sure she had a firm grip on the chains. "Ready?" Lily nodded eagerly, and James began to push. With each gentle push, Lily soared higher and higher, her laughter ringing out across the quiet park. James watched her with pride, his heart full of love for this little girl who had become his daughter in every way that mattered. After a while, Lily called out, "Daddy, can I have a snack? I'm hungry." James helped her slow down and hop off the swing. They made their way to a nearby bench where James had left their bag. He pulled out a small container of cut-up fruit and a juice box, handing them to Lily. As Lily munched on her snack, James sat beside her, his arm draped protectively around her shoulders. They chatted about her upcoming school project and the new book they'd been reading together at bedtime. Meanwhile, Janet was hurrying along the sidewalk, her mind preoccupied with thoughts of her new job at Martha's department store. She was eager to do well on her second official day. As she passed by the park, something caught her eye. Janet slowed her pace, her gaze fixed on a scene that made her blood run cold. There, sitting on a bench, was a large black man with a small white girl. Janet's mind immediately jumped to the worst possible conclusion. "Oh my God," she muttered to herself, her heart racing. "That poor child. He must be trying to kidnap her." Janet's prejudices and fears clouded her judgment, preventing her from seeing the loving interaction between James and Lily. Instead, all she could focus on was the color of James's skin and how it differed from Lily's. Without a second thought, Janet reached into her purse and pulled out her phone. Her hands shook as she dialed 911. her eyes never leaving James and Lily. 911, what's your emergency? Came the operator's voice. Yes, hello, Janet said, her voice hushed and urgent. I'm at City Park, and there's a suspicious black man with a white child. I think he might be trying to abduct her. Can you describe what you're seeing, ma'am? The operator asked calmly. Janet proceeded to give a detailed description of James and Lily, emphasizing James's race and size. Please hurry, she added. Who knows what he might do to that poor little girl? We have a patrol car just across the street, the operator assured her. They'll be there within 2 minutes. Please stay on the line and keep your distance from the situation. Janet agreed, her heart pounding as she watched James and Lily from behind a nearby tree. She was convinced she was doing the right thing, never once considering the possibility that she might be wrong. As promised, within 2 minutes, Janet heard the sound of a police siren approaching. She breathed a sigh of relief, certain that she had just saved a child from a terrible fate. The sound of sirens pierced the peaceful morning air, growing louder as a police car pulled into the park. 2 officers quickly exited the vehicle, their eyes scanning the area. Janet, her heart racing with a mix of fear and self-righteousness, waved them over. Over there, she called out, pointing towards James and Lily. That's the man I told you about. The officers nodded and approached James, who was now sitting on a bench reading a newspaper. Lily was nearby, happily swinging and humming to herself. James looked up as the officers neared, his brow furrowing in confusion. Sir, we need to speak with you, one of the officers said, his hand resting on his belt. James folded his newspaper and set it aside. Of course, officers. Is there a problem? The second officer glanced at Lily, then back at James. We received a report of suspicious activity involving a child. Can you explain your relationship to the girl? James remained calm, though his heart began to race. That's my daughter, Lily. We're just enjoying a morning at the park together. Janet, emboldened by the officer's presence, stepped forward. I saw him acting very suspiciously with her, she insisted, her voice shrill. He's lying. Just look at the color of his skin. The officers exchanged glances, then turned back to James. Despite his composed demeanor and explanation, they seemed to be taking Janet's words seriously. Sir, we're going to need you to come with us to the station, the first officer said, his tone firm. We need to verify your story and ensure the child's safety. James's eyes widened in disbelief. Officers, there's been a misunderstanding. I'm Lily's stepfather. Let me show you some pictures from my phone. Sir, please stand up and put your hands behind your back. Those pictures can also be doctored. The second officer interrupted, reaching for his handcuffs. James slowly stood, his mind reeling. He couldn't believe this was happening. As the officer began to restrain him, Lily noticed the commotion. Her little face crumpled in fear and confusion as she ran over. Daddy, she cried out, tears welling in her eyes. What's happening? Why are they hurting you? James tried to maintain a calm voice for Lily's sake. It's okay, sweetheart. There's just been a mix-up. Can you be a brave girl and call Mommy for me? The officers exchanged uncertain glances as they witnessed the interaction between James and Lily. Janet, however, remained unmoved. Don't let him fool you, she insisted. He's probably trained her to call him that. You're doing the right thing by taking him in. Lily's sobs grew louder as she clung to James's leg. Please don't take my daddy away, she pleaded, her small body shaking with fear. Lily's tears flowed freely as she clung tightly to James's leg. Her small hands gripped the fabric of his pants, her voice trembling as she pleaded, Please don't take my daddy away. The officers were clearly taken aback by the child's distress and her use of the word daddy. The first officer knelt down to Lily's eye level, his voice softening as he spoke. Sweetie, can you tell us who this man is to you? He asked gently. Lily sniffled, wiping her nose with the back of her hand. She looked up at James, then back at the officer. He's my daddy, she said firmly. He takes care of me and Mommy. Janet stood nearby, her mouth agape. She couldn't believe what she was hearing. How could this be possible? She had been so sure, so convinced that she was doing the right thing. But as she watched Lily's tearful defense of James, doubt began to creep in. Despite this, Janet's stubbornness prevented her from admitting her mistake. Instead, she doubled down, her voice laced with barely concealed contempt. "Well, I still think it's strange," she muttered loudly enough for everyone to hear. "I mean, how do we know this isn't some kind of arrangement?" James, who had remained silent throughout Lily's explanation, finally spoke. His voice was calm and measured, despite the anger he must have felt. "Officers, may I speak with you privately for a moment?" The officers nodded, and James gently detached Lily from his leg, kneeling down to look her in the eyes. "It's okay, sweetheart. I'm not going anywhere. Can you sit on the bench for a minute while I talk to the nice officers?" Lily nodded bravely, wiping away her tears. James stood and walked a short distance away with the officers, deliberately turning his back on Janet and her racist remarks. "I understand the difficult position you're in," James began, his voice low and steady. "I want to explain the situation clearly. My name is James Brown. I married Martha, Lily's mother, 5 years ago. Martha owns the department store on Main Street, Brown's department store. You can call her to confirm everything I'm telling you. Have a look at my phone. This is nothing but a misunderstanding." He paused, making sure the officers were following. "I've been a part of Lily's life since she was a toddler. I may not be her biological father, but I love her as my own. What you're witnessing here is simply a family enjoying a day at the park." The officers listened intently, their expressions shifting from suspicion to understanding. The first officer nodded slowly. "Mr. Brown, we apologize for the misunderstanding. We take all reports seriously, but it's clear now that there's been a mistake." The second officer chimed in. "We're sorry for the distress this has caused you and your daughter. You're free to go, of course." James nodded, accepting their apology with grace. "I understand you were just doing your job. Thank you for listening and for treating us with respect." As the officers turned to leave, James walked back to Lily, who was waiting anxiously on the bench. He scooped her up in his arms, holding her close. "It's all okay now, sweetheart," he murmured, kissing the top of her head. "Everything's fine." As the police officers walked away, James took a deep breath, steadying himself. He gently set Lily down on the bench, giving her a reassuring smile. "Stay right here, sweetie. I need to talk to the lady for a minute." Lily told James that Janet had been in the store the other day, interviewing for some role. Connecting the dots together, James knew that Janet was the girl Martha had hired. James turned to face Janet, who stood awkwardly a few feet away. His expression was stern but composed as he approached her. "Ma'am, I think we need to have a conversation about what just happened here." Janet shifted uncomfortably, her earlier confidence now replaced with unease. "I was just trying to protect the child," she mumbled, avoiding eye contact. James shook his head, his voice firm but controlled. "No. What you did was make a dangerous assumption based solely on the color of my skin. Do you understand how your actions could have ended very differently?" Janet opened her mouth to speak, but James held up a hand, cutting her off. "I'm not finished. Your prejudice nearly tore apart my family today. My daughter was terrified, thinking she might lose her father. And for what? Because you couldn't fathom that a black man and a white child could be family?" He paused, letting his words sink in. "But there's something else you should know, Janet. I'm James Brown, co-owner of Brown's department store, the very place where you just started working." Janet's eyes widened in shock, her face paling as the realization hit her. James continued, his voice steady but filled with disappointment. "The store my wife and I built is founded on principles of respect, inclusivity, and community. What you've demonstrated today goes against everything we stand for." He looked her directly in the eyes, his gaze unwavering. "Your actions weren't just hurtful to me and my family. They're harmful to our entire community. We can't have someone with your mindset representing our business or interacting with our diverse customer base." Janet stammered, trying to find words to defend herself, but James pressed on. "I'm sorry, Janet, but your employment with Brown's department store is terminated, effective immediately. We have a zero-tolerance policy for racism and discrimination of any kind." The weight of James's words hung heavy in the air. Janet stood speechless, her face a mix of shock and humiliation. The consequences of her actions had come swiftly and decisively. James turned away from Janet, walking back to Lily, He scooped her up in his arms, holding her close. "Come on, sweetheart. Let's go home and see Mommy. I think we've had enough excitement for one day." As James walked away with Lily, Janet remained rooted to the spot, left alone to process the immediate fallout of her prejudiced actions. Soon after, Janet stumbled away from the park, her mind spinning. The weight of what had just happened pressed down on her like a heavy blanket. "How could this happen?" she muttered to herself, her voice shaky. The job she'd been so proud of, gone in an instant. And for what? She tried to convince herself she'd done the right thing, but deep down, a nagging voice told her otherwise. Meanwhile, James pulled into the driveway of their cozy suburban home. Lily had fallen asleep during the ride, exhausted from the morning's events. He gently lifted her from the car seat, cradling her close as he walked to the front door. Martha greeted them at the entrance, her smile fading as she saw the serious expression on James's face. "What happened?" she asked softly, stepping aside to let them in. James laid Lily down on the living room couch, covering her with a soft throw blanket. He turned to Martha, taking a deep breath. "We need to talk," he said, leading her to the kitchen. As they sat at the kitchen table, James recounted the incident at the park. Martha's eyes widened in disbelief as he described Janet's actions and accusations. "I can't believe she would do that," Martha whispered, shaking her head. "And to think I hired her?" James reached across the table, taking Martha's hand in his. "You couldn't have known, honey. But there's something else you should know." He paused, squeezing her hand gently. "I had to fire her." Martha nodded slowly, understanding. "Of course. We can't have someone like that working in our store." They sat in silence for a moment, both processing the day's events. Then a small voice came from the couch. "Daddy? Mommy?" They turned to see Lily sitting there, rubbing her eyes sleepily. James opened his arms, and Lily ran to him, climbing into his lap. Martha moved her chair closer, wrapping her arms around both James and Lily. "We're a family," she said firmly, "no matter what anyone else thinks or says." As they sat there holding each other close, they felt a renewed sense of unity and strength. The incident had been hurtful, but it had also shown them the depth of their love and the unbreakable bonds of their family. After a few hours, when the sun had dipped below the horizon, Janet's footsteps echoed in the stillness as she approached the familiar building, her heart heavy with a mix of anger and shame. She hesitated at the entrance, taking a deep breath before pushing open the door. The store felt different now, almost alien. The warmth and welcome she had felt on her first day were gone, replaced by a cold, unwelcoming atmosphere. Janet's footsteps echoed through the empty aisles as she made her way to the back of the store. Martha was waiting for her, arms crossed and face set in a neutral expression. "Your things are in the storeroom," she said, her voice devoid of its usual warmth. "Please collect them and leave." Janet nodded silently, avoiding Martha's gaze as she slipped past her into the storeroom. The small space felt cramped and oppressive now, a far cry from the busy hub of activity it had been just days ago. As Janet began to gather her belongings, her eyes swept the room, taking in the shelves stacked with inventory and the piles of paperwork. In the corner, partially hidden behind some old boxes, she spotted a dusty container she hadn't noticed before. Curiosity piqued, she moved closer, pushing aside the boxes to reveal a worn cardboard box. Glancing over her shoulder to ensure she was alone, Janet carefully opened the box. Inside, she found a stack of old documents, financial records, contracts, and other official-looking papers. As she rifled through them, a manila envelope caught her eye. The label read "Lily's Adoption" in faded ink. Janet's heart raced as she held the envelope. She knew she shouldn't open it, that it was none of her business, but the desire for revenge burned hot within her. With trembling hands, she slid the papers out of the envelope. Her eyes scanned the documents quickly, taking in the legal jargon until she found what she was looking for: the name of Lily's biological father, Frank Owens. The papers also included his last known address and other personal details. A slow, vengeful smile spread across Janet's face as she hurriedly copied down the information into her phone. This could be her chance to get back at James and Martha, to make them regret ever crossing her. If she could find Frank, who knows what kind of chaos she could stir up in their perfect little family. Janet quickly shoved the papers back into the envelope and returned the box to its original position. She gathered her belongings and made her way back to the front of the store, her mind racing with possibilities. Martha was waiting by the door, her expression unreadable. "Janet," she said softly as Janet approached, "I hope you can learn from this experience. There's no place for racism in our town or anywhere else. Please, try to be a better person." Janet plastered on a fake smile, nodding in agreement. "Of course, Martha. I understand completely. Thank you for the opportunity, and I'm sorry things didn't work out." The words felt hollow in her mouth, but she maintained her facade of sincerity. As Janet stepped out into the cool evening air, she felt a surge of excitement. The information in her phone felt like a ticking time bomb, ready to explode James and Martha's perfect life. She walked away from the store, her steps light with anticipation, never looking back at the life she could have had. Before she even got home, Janet pulled her car on the side of the street, thinking about how she could use this information against Martha and James. She then decided to visit Frank, telling him about his daughter, in the hopes that maybe he would want her back, leading to chaos in Martha's life. Off she went, to the address that she had taken a picture of from those documents. As she navigated through the busy streets, Janet's thoughts raced with possibilities. How would Frank react to the news about Lily? Would he be angry, desperate to reconnect with his long-lost daughter? Or would he be indifferent, giving Janet the leverage she needed to manipulate the situation? Either way, she was certain she could use this information to her advantage. The GPS chimed, indicating she was nearing her destination. Janet's grip on the steering wheel tightened as she turned into a neighborhood that had clearly seen better days. Faded buildings and overgrown lawns lined the streets, a stark contrast to the polished appearance of Martha and James's store. Janet parked her car in front of a weathered apartment complex, double-checking the address on her phone. This was it, Frank's supposed residence. She took a deep breath, steeling herself for the confrontation to come, and stepped out of the car. The building's entrance was propped open with a brick, revealing a dimly lit hallway beyond. Janet wrinkled her nose at the musty smell as she made her way inside, scanning the doors for Frank's apartment number. She found it at the end of the hall, a scratched and dented door with peeling paint. Heart pounding, Janet raised her hand and knocked firmly on the door. Silence greeted her. She waited a moment, then knocked again, louder this time. Still nothing. Frustration bubbled up inside her as she called out, "Mr. Owens, Frank Owens, I have important information about your daughter, Lily." Janet pressed her ear to the door, straining to hear any movement inside. The apartment remained stubbornly quiet. She glanced around the empty hallway, half expecting someone to emerge and question her presence, but she was alone. Minutes ticked by as Janet alternated between knocking and calling out, her voice growing more insistent with each attempt. But the door remained firmly closed, her words met only by silence. With a final, frustrated glare at the unresponsive door, Janet turned on her heel and stormed back to her car. This wasn't how it was supposed to go. Frank was meant to be here, eager to learn about the daughter he had given up. Instead, she was left with nothing but unanswered questions and simmering anger. As Janet pulled away from the curb, her mind raced with alternatives. If Frank truly cared about Lily, he would reach out once he heard her message. And if he didn't, well, she would find another way to use this information. Perhaps she could blackmail Martha and James, threatening to reveal Lily's true parentage unless they gave her what she wanted. The car sped through the streets, carrying Janet away from the rundown neighborhood and back towards the more familiar parts of town. Her initial plan may have failed, but Janet was far from giving up. One way or another, she would make James and Martha pay for what they had done to her. This setback was just a minor obstacle in her quest for revenge. Later that evening, Frank Owens finally showed up to his apartment. The weight of a long day at the construction site hung heavy on his shoulders as he fumbled with his keys, finally pushing open the door with a sigh of relief. Frank's apartment was a testament to simplicity, a worn couch, a small TV, and a kitchenette, but it was his, and it was honest. He kicked off his muddy work boots, leaving them by the door, and made his way to the ancient laptop perched on a rickety table. With practiced movements, Frank booted up the computer and clicked on the icon for his door camera app. It was a habit he'd developed over the years, a small measure of security since he lived all alone. As the footage began to play, Frank's eyes widened, his body tensing at the sight of an unfamiliar woman standing at his door. The woman's voice came through the speakers, tinny but clear enough. "Mr. Owens? Frank Owens? I have important information about your daughter, Lily." Frank's heart lurched in his chest, the name Lily echoing in his mind like a distant bell. For a moment, memories threatened to overwhelm him. The soft coo of a baby, the smell of talcum powder, the weight of a tiny hand in his. But as quickly as they came, Frank pushed them away, shaking his head as if to dislodge the thoughts physically. "It's just a coincidence," he muttered to himself, his voice rough in the quiet apartment. "Lots of girls named Lily in the world. Doesn't mean anything." Frank closed the laptop with more force than necessary, pushing himself up from the chair. He made his way to the couch, sinking into its familiar embrace with a heavy sigh. As he stared at the water-stained ceiling, the past he'd tried so hard to leave behind came rushing back. He remembered the hazy days and sleepless nights, the constant craving that had ruled his every waking moment. He saw Martha's face, twisted with worry and fear, heard the echoes of their countless arguments. Worst of all, he recalled the moment he'd realized he was a danger to his own child, the day he'd almost dropped Lily while in a drug-induced stupor. The memory of signing away his parental rights was both painful and a relief. Frank had known then, as he knew now, that it was the best thing he could do for Lily. She deserved a chance at a normal life, free from the chaos and instability he brought with him. "She's better off without me," Frank whispered to the empty room. "She always has been." Frank closed his eyes, willing the memories and the guilt to recede. He took a deep breath, then another, focusing on the present moment, the feel of the couch beneath him, the distant hum of traffic outside his window. "It's done," he told himself firmly. "Lily's got a good life now, far away from all this." He gestured vaguely at his sparse surroundings, a physical representation of the struggles he'd faced. As for the strange visitor, Frank decided it was better not to dwell on it. Whatever her reasons for coming, he couldn't let himself get caught up in the past again. He'd made his choice years ago, and he had to stick by it, no matter how much it hurt. Frank shifted on the couch, trying to find a comfortable position. He'd sleep here tonight, too tired to make it to the bedroom. As he drifted off, he repeated the mantra he'd clung to for years. "I did the right thing. I did the right thing." But even as sleep claimed him, a small part of Frank couldn't help but wonder about the life he'd left behind, and the daughter he'd never truly known. After reaching home, Janet paced her small living room, her footsteps echoing in the cramped space. She glanced at the clock on the wall, its steady ticking a reminder that time was slipping away. She then checked her phone for all the details that she had related to Frank and saw a mobile number that she had previously overlooked. "This is it," she muttered to herself, her voice tight with determination. "I can't lose this chance." The room around her was a mess, reflecting her inner turmoil. Unpaid bills were scattered across the coffee table, and half-empty takeout containers littered the kitchen counter. But Janet's focus was solely on the number in her hand and the revenge it promised. With shaking fingers, Janet punched the numbers into her phone. Just as she was about to give up, a gruff voice answered. "Hello?" Frank's tone was wary, tinged with exhaustion. Janet took a deep breath, steadying herself. "Mr. Owens, this is Janet Mary. I tried to visit you earlier today. I have some important information about your daughter, Lily." There was a long pause on the other end of the line. When Frank spoke again, his voice had turned cold, like ice spreading through the phone. "I saw you on my door camera. Look, I don't know who you are or what you want, but I want nothing to do with Lily." Janet's eyes widened in surprise. This wasn't the reaction she'd expected. "But Mr. Owens, don't you want to know about your daughter? She's—" Frank cut her off abruptly. "I made my decision years ago. Nothing you say can change that. I don't want to hear about Lily, and I don't want you contacting me again. Is that clear?" Janet tried to interject, desperation creeping into her voice. "But you don't understand." "No, you don't understand," Frank said. his voice firm and final. "Never contact me again. Goodbye." The line went dead, leaving Janet standing in stunned silence. Janet stared at her phone in disbelief, the call-ended screen mocking her failed attempt. Her carefully laid plan was unraveling before her eyes, and the realization hit her like a physical blow. Frank wasn't going to be the easy pawn she had hoped for. With a cry of frustration, Janet hurled her phone onto the couch. It bounced once before settling among the cushions, a silent reminder of her defeat. "This isn't over," she hissed through clenched teeth, her hands balling into fists at her sides. "I won't give up so easily. I'll find another way to make them pay." She then had a cunning idea that would not just cause trouble for James and Martha, but also earn her some money while she was at it. She decided to blackmail them under Frank's name. With careful strokes, Janet began to craft a letter. She imagined Frank's voice, trying to capture the tone of a desperate father seeking to reconnect with his long-lost daughter. Janet's pen scratched across the paper, filling it with carefully chosen words designed to instill fear and uncertainty. She demanded a substantial sum of money, threatening to reveal the truth about Lily's adoption if James and Martha didn't comply. As she wrote, a smirk played on her lips, imagining the chaos this letter would bring to their seemingly perfect lives. After what felt like hours, Janet sat back admiring her handiwork. The letter lay before her, a ticking time bomb waiting to explode in James and Martha's faces. She folded it carefully, sliding it into an envelope and sealing it with a lick. Under the cover of darkness, Janet drove to James and Martha's home. Her heart raced as she approached their mailbox, glancing around nervously to ensure no one was watching. With trembling hands, she slipped the letter inside, closing the box with a soft click that seemed to echo in the quiet night. As she hurried back to her car, Janet felt a rush of adrenaline. Her plan was in motion, and soon, she thought, James and Martha would pay for humiliating her. Later that night, James pulled into the driveway, tired from a long day at work. As he walked towards the house, he noticed the mailbox flag was up. Curious, he opened it and retrieved a single envelope. Inside, he flicked on the living room light and opened the letter. As his eyes scanned the contents, a knot of dread formed in his stomach. The words blurred before him, but their meaning was clear. Frank was demanding money to keep Lily's adoption a secret. "Martha!" James called out, his voice strained. "You need to see this." Martha hurried into the room, her face etched with concern. "What is it, James?" He handed her the letter wordlessly, watching as her expression changed from confusion to shock, and then to fear. "This can't be from Frank," Martha whispered, her hands shaking. "Why would he do this now, after all these years?" James wrapped an arm around her shoulders, trying to offer comfort even as his own mind raced with worry. "I don't know, honey, but we'll figure this out together. We knew there would come a time when Lily would learn about this herself, but even then, we won't let anyone threaten our family." They stood there, the letter between them, unsure of what to do next, but determined to protect the life they had built together. James sighed, rubbing his tired eyes. "Maybe he's in trouble, needs money. People can change, Martha. We don't know what his life has been like since he left." Martha shook her head, her brow furrowed in determination. "No, something doesn't add up. We need to talk to him, James. Face to face. It's the only way we'll know for sure." James hesitated, weighing the risks. "Are you sure that's wise? What if he really is behind this? We could be walking into a trap." "And what if he's not?" Martha countered, her eyes meeting James's. "We owe it to Lily to find out the truth. We can't live with this hanging over our heads." As the night wore on, they debated back and forth, considering every angle. The thought of confronting Frank filled them both with anxiety, but the alternative, living in fear of when the next demand might come, seemed even worse. The next morning, after seeing Lily off to school with forced smiles and reassurances, James and Martha climbed into their car. The address from the old adoption papers was clutched in Martha's hand, a roadmap to a past they thought they'd left behind. As they drove through unfamiliar neighborhoods, the tension in the car was palpable. James's knuckles were white on the steering wheel, while Martha stared out the window, lost in thought. "What are we going to say to him?" James asked, breaking the silence. Martha took a deep breath. "We'll show him the letter. Ask him directly if he sent it. If he did, well, we'll deal with that when we have to." They pulled up to a modest apartment complex, the same one Janet had visited days before. As they walked up to Frank's door, Martha reached for James's hand, squeezing it for reassurance. James raised his hand and knocked firmly on the door. For a moment, there was silence, and then they heard movement inside. The door opened, revealing a man with graying hair and tired eyes. His eyes widened in recognition as he saw Martha, then flickered with confusion to James. "Martha?" Frank said, his voice rough with surprise. "What are you doing here?" Martha swallowed hard, then gestured to James. "Frank, this is my husband, James. We need to talk to you about something important." Frank's gaze darted between them, uncertainty clear on his face. "What's this about?" James pulled out the letter, unfolding it carefully. "We received this yesterday. It's a threat. Someone claiming to be you is demanding money to keep Lily's adoption a secret." Frank's face paled as he took the letter, his hands shaking slightly as he read it. When he looked up, his eyes were wide with shock and confusion. I didn't write this," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I swear. I had nothing to do with this letter." Frank stepped back from the doorway, his face a mix of confusion and concern. "Please, come in," he said, gesturing towards the small living room of his modest apartment. "We should talk about this." James and Martha exchanged a glance before following Frank inside. Frank motioned for them to sit on the couch while he pulled up a chair from the nearby kitchenette. "I want you both to know," Frank began, his voice earnest. "I never sent any threats. I wouldn't do that to Lily or to you, Martha. I made my choice years ago, and I've stuck by it." Martha nodded slowly, her eyes searching Frank's face for any sign of deception. "We believe you, Frank. But if you didn't send this, who did? And why?" Frank ran a hand through his graying hair, his brow furrowed in thought. "I honestly don't know. But before we get into that, can I ask how Lily is doing?" James and Martha shared a look, silently communicating. After a moment, Martha reached into her purse and pulled out her phone. She scrolled through it briefly before turning it to show Frank a photo. "This is from her school play last month," Martha said softly. She played the lead role. In the picture, Lily stood center stage, her face beaming with pride as she took a bow. Her long brown hair was braided, and she wore a colorful costume that sparkled under the stage lights. Frank's eyes widened as he looked at the photo, a small smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. "She's beautiful," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "She looks so happy." Martha nodded, her own eyes misting slightly. "She is. She's a wonderful girl, Frank. Smart, kind, always trying to help others." Frank leaned back in his chair, his posture relaxing slightly. "I'm glad," he said. "That's all I ever wanted for her. You know, I've been sober for 7 years now. It wasn't easy, but I did it for her. Even if she'd never know." James leaned forward, his expression softening. "That's commendable, Frank. Really." Frank's face suddenly tensed, as if remembering something important. "You know, now that I think about it, I may have an idea who might be behind this letter." Martha and James straightened, their attention fully focused on Frank. "Yesterday, a woman came to my door," Frank continued. "I didn't answer, but I saw her on my security camera. She was saying something about Lily, but I ignored it. I thought it was just a coincidence." Frank stood up and walked over to a small desk in the corner of the room. He opened his laptop and pulled up a video file. "Here, take a look." As the video played, showing Janet standing at Frank's door, Martha gasped. "That's Janet!" she exclaimed, turning to James with wide eyes. Frank nodded grimly. "She called me later too, trying to tell me she had information about Lily. I shut her down pretty quick and told her I didn't want anything to do with it." James and Martha sat in stunned silence, the realization of Janet's involvement sinking in. James and Martha stood up from Frank's worn couch, a mix of emotions playing across their faces. Relief at Frank's innocence mingled with concern over Janet's involvement. "Thank you, Frank," Martha said softly. "We really appreciate your honesty and help." Frank nodded, his eyes still holding a hint of sadness. "I just want what's best for Lily. I hope you know that." James stepped forward, extending his hand to Frank. "We do. And we're grateful for the choice you made years ago. It couldn't have been easy." Frank shook James's hand firmly. "It wasn't. But seeing her now, knowing she's happy and loved, it was worth it." As they made their way to the door, Martha turned back. "Frank, if you ever want to know how she's doing, you can reach out to us. We won't keep you in the dark." Frank's eyes widened slightly, a flicker of hope crossing his face. Thank you. That means a lot." With final nods of goodbye, James and Martha left Frank's apartment, their steps quick with purpose as they headed to their car. Back at home, James and Martha wasted no time. They spread out papers on the dining room table, rifling through files and folders. "We need something concrete," James muttered, his brow furrowed in concentration. "Something that ties Janet directly to that letter." Martha nodded, her hands moving swiftly through a stack of papers. Suddenly she paused, her eyes lighting up. "Wait a minute. What about Janet's job application? The one she filled out during her interview?" James looked up, realization dawning on his face. "That's brilliant, Martha. If we can match the handwriting." Martha was already on her feet, heading to the small home office. She returned moments later with a folder labeled New Hires. Opening it, she quickly found Janet's application form. With trembling hands, Martha placed Janet's application form next to the threatening letter. James leaned in close, his eyes darting between the two documents. "Look at the way she forms her Y's and G's," Martha pointed out, her finger tracing the letters. "And the slant of her writing. It's identical." James nodded slowly, a grim smile spreading across his face. "You're right. It's a perfect match. Combined with Frank's security footage." Martha let out a long breath, relief and determination mingling in her voice. "We've got her, James. We can prove what she did." They looked at each other, the weight of the situation settling over them. They had the evidence they needed to confront Janet and put an end to her schemes. Now, it was time to decide their next move. Martha picked up the phone, her fingers trembling slightly as she dialed the local police station. James sat beside her, his hand resting gently on her shoulder for support. As the line connected, Martha took a deep breath, steeling herself for the conversation ahead. "Hello, this is Martha Brown. I need to report a case of harassment and forgery," she began, her voice clear and determined. The officer on the other end listened patiently as Martha explained the situation, detailing Janet's actions since being fired and the forged letter they had received. James watched his wife, admiring her strength and composure. He squeezed her shoulder gently, offering silent encouragement as she continued to relay the details to the police. About 25 minutes after Martha's call, a sharp knock sounded at their front door. James rose to answer it, revealing a uniformed police officer standing on their porch. "Good afternoon, Mr. and Mrs. Brown. I'm Officer Johnson. We spoke on the phone earlier about the harassment case," the officer said, his tone professional but kind. Martha nodded, inviting him inside. "Yes, thank you for coming so quickly. We have everything ready to show you." They led Officer Johnson to the dining room table where they had laid out the evidence. Martha carefully explained each piece, starting with Janet's job application form. "This is the application Janet filled out when she interviewed for the position at our store," Martha said, pointing to the document. "And here's the forged letter we received, claiming to be from Lily's biological father." Officer Johnson leaned in, examining the handwriting closely. "The similarities are quite apparent," he noted, his eyes moving between the two documents. James then played the security footage from Frank's apartment, showing Janet at his door. "This is Janet attempting to contact Frank, Lily's biological father, without our knowledge," James explained. Martha continued, her voice steady but tinged with emotion. Janet has been causing trouble ever since we had to let her go due to her racist behavior. She's using Frank's name and our daughter's past to try and hurt us." Officer Johnson finished taking notes, his expression serious as he looked up at James and Martha. "Thank you for providing all this information. We take these matters very seriously, and I assure you we will investigate thoroughly." Martha let out a small sigh of relief while James nodded gratefully. "What happens next?" James asked, his arm around Martha's shoulders. "We'll review all the evidence you've provided and follow up with Janet," Officer Johnson explained. "We may need to speak with you again, but for now, try not to worry. If you want, you can come with us as we go to her house." As the officer prepared to leave, Martha and James exchanged a look of cautious hope. They knew the road ahead might still be challenging, but for the first time since this ordeal began, they felt a sense of progress. They decided to accompany Officer Johnson to Janet's apartment. Back at her place, Janet lounged on her worn sofa, a smug smile playing on her lips. She imagined the chaos unfolding at James and Martha's home, picturing their distress as they grappled with the forged letter. In her mind, she saw them trembling, their perfect little world crumbling around them. "They must be falling apart by now," she muttered to herself, relishing the thought. "Serves them right for firing me." She reached for the remote, ready to indulge in some mindless TV to celebrate her perceived victory. But before she could turn it on, a sharp knock at the door made her jump. Frowning, Janet set down the remote and made her way to the door. She wasn't expecting anyone, and a flicker of unease passed through her. Shaking it off, she plastered on a neutral expression and opened the door. Her eyes widened as she found herself face to face with two stern-looking police officers. "Ms. Janet Mary?" one of them asked, his voice firm. Janet nodded, her mouth suddenly dry. "Yes, that's me. Is something wrong?" "We need to ask you some questions about a harassment case," the officer continued. "May we come in?" Janet's heart raced, but she forced herself to remain calm. "Of course," she said, stepping aside to let them enter. "But I'm not sure what this is about." As the officers stepped into her living room, Janet's mind whirled. She tried to think of a way out, to come up with a convincing story. "Ms. Mary, we have evidence linking you to a forged letter sent to James and Martha Brown," the second officer explained, pulling out a folder. "Can you explain your involvement?" Janet's face paled, but she quickly composed herself. "I don't know anything about a letter," she lied, her voice trembling slightly. "There must be some mistake." The officers exchanged a glance before presenting her with copies of the forged letter and her job application. "The handwriting matches, Ms. Mary, and we have video evidence of you visiting Frank, Lily's biological father." Janet's confidence crumbled as she realized the extent of the evidence against her. She opened her mouth to protest, but no words came out. "We have a warrant to search your premises," the first officer stated, producing the document. "Please step aside." As the officers began their search, Janet's mind raced, trying to remember if she had left any incriminating evidence lying around. She watched helplessly as they methodically went through her belongings. Her heart sank when one of the officers emerged from her bedroom holding a folder. "We found these," he said, showing several crumpled papers to his partner. Janet recognized them immediately, rough drafts of the threatening letter she had sent to James and Martha. The weight of her actions finally crashed down on Janet as one of the officers approached her with handcuffs. "Janet Mary, you're under arrest for harassment and forgery," he said, securing the cuffs around her wrists. As they led her out of her apartment, Janet's eyes darted around frantically. That's when she spotted them, James and Martha standing at a distance watching the scene unfold. Their faces were a mix of relief and sadness. "Wait!" Janet cried out, her voice cracking. "James, Martha, please. I never meant to hurt you. I was angry. Please, you have to believe me." But her pleas fell on deaf ears as the officers gently but firmly guided her towards the waiting police car. Janet's shoulders slumped in defeat as the reality of her situation sank in. As she was placed in the back seat, she caught one last glimpse of James and Martha, their expressions unreadable. Martha and James went back home, the weight of the day's events heavy on their shoulders. They moved to the living room, sinking onto the couch with matching sighs of exhaustion. "I can't believe it's finally over," Martha said, her voice barely above a whisper. James reached out and took her hand, giving it a gentle squeeze. "I know, honey. It's been a roller coaster." They sat in silence for a moment, each lost in their own thoughts. The ticking of the clock on the wall seemed unnaturally loud in the quiet room. "I'm worried about Lily," Martha finally said, turning to face her husband. "How do we explain all this to her? She's so young, James. I don't want her to be scared or confused." James nodded, his brow furrowed with concern. "You're right. We need to be careful about how we handle this. She's perceptive. She'll know something's up." They spent the next hour discussing how to approach the situation with Lily. They agreed that honesty was the best policy, but they needed to find a way to explain things without overwhelming her. "We should keep it simple," James suggested. "Focus on the positive outcome rather than the details of what Janet did." Martha nodded in agreement. "And we can use this as a teachable moment, about forgiveness and standing up for what's right." "Exactly," James said, a small smile forming on his lips. "We'll emphasize how important it is to treat everyone with kindness and respect, regardless of their differences." They continued to talk, working out the best way to explain the situation to Lily. As the afternoon wore on, they felt more prepared and united in their approach. The sound of the front door opening announced Lily's return from school. "Mom? Dad? I'm home," her cheerful voice called out. Martha and James exchanged a look before calling back, "We're in the living room, sweetheart." Lily bounded in, her backpack still on her shoulders, but her smile faded as she noticed the serious expressions on her parents' faces. "What's wrong?" she asked, her voice small and worried. "Did something bad happen?" James patted the space between him and Martha on the couch. "Come here, Lily. We want to talk to you about something." Lily climbed onto the couch, looking from one parent to the other with concern in her eyes. Martha took a deep breath and began, "Honey, someone tried to cause some trouble for our family today, but everything's okay now. The police helped us, and we're all safe." "Who tried to cause trouble?" Lily asked, her eyes wide. James gently explained, "It was Janet, the lady who worked at the store for a short time. She did some things that weren't very nice or honest." "But why?" Lily's voice trembled slightly. Martha pulled her daughter close. "Sometimes people do hurtful things when they're angry or scared. But what's important is that we stand up for what's right, just like you did at the park that day." James nodded, adding, "And even though what Janet did was wrong, it's important to forgive. Not because what she did was okay, but because forgiveness helps us move forward and be happy." Lily was quiet for a moment, processing what her parents had said. Then she wrapped her arms around both of them, pulling them into a group hug. "I love you, Mom and Dad," she said, her voice muffled against them. "I'm glad we're all okay." Janet sat on the hard, narrow bed in her cell, her back against the cold concrete wall. The stark reality of her situation was finally sinking in. She closed her eyes, letting out a deep sigh as memories of the past few weeks flooded her mind. How had she ended up here? Where had it all gone so wrong? Janet's thoughts drifted back to her childhood, growing up in a small town where everyone looked like her. She remembered the subtle comments her parents would make about people who were different, the way they'd lock the car doors when driving through certain neighborhoods. At the time, it had seemed normal, even right. As she grew older, Janet had clung to those beliefs, using them as a shield against her own insecurities and failures. She had convinced herself that she deserved more simply because of who she was, that her struggles were someone else's fault. The image of James and Lily in the park flashed through her mind. Janet winced, remembering the immediate suspicion and fear she had felt upon seeing them together. She had been so quick to judge, so certain that she was doing the right thing by calling the police. "I was trying to protect the child," she whispered to herself, but the words rang hollow in the empty cell. For the first time, Janet allowed herself to truly examine her actions. She thought about the fear in Lily's eyes when the police had approached James, the hurt and anger on Martha's face when she realized what Janet had done. These were real people with real lives, and she had carelessly thrown their world into chaos because of her own prejudices. Janet's mind wandered to the department store, to the opportunity she had been given. Martha had welcomed her, trusted her. And how had Janet repaid that trust? By snooping through private documents and concocting a scheme to hurt them even more. A tear slipped down Janet's cheek as the weight of her actions settled on her shoulders. She had been so consumed by her own sense of entitlement and superiority that she had lost sight of basic human decency. "I really messed up," she murmured, her voice barely audible in the quiet cell. For the first time in her life, Janet felt truly alone, and in that loneliness, she started to understand the pain she had caused others with her words and actions. If you enjoyed the story of James, I handpicked this next story that you will enjoy. Please don't miss this one. Click here to watch it.